For more on Scott Pruitt's long list of ethical scandals, I'm joined by Dan Cannon. He's former White House liaison to the EPA under President Obama, and Kristen Mink, who you may recognize as the mother and teacher who confronted Pruitt earlier this week at a D.C. restaurant asking him to resign. And Kristen, I'll start with you.
Sure.
It worked.
That's very generous. That's very generous, Chris. I think that I was one of a barrage of nails in this coffin that Scott Pruitt really built himself. Obviously, so much of this credit goes to investigative journalists, like I think it was Caitlin Collins who broke the Sessions scandal story. Activist groups, environmental groups like the Working Families Party. So there are so many people who have been really working on getting Scott Pruitt out of this position, and I'm glad that I could add to that snowball effect here in his final days.
Dan, let's talk about what the crossroads to the EPA here, because you heard Juliet, and the agenda there really is quite retrograde, aggressively so. It was what kept him there. What is your perception of where the EPA is right now on this day?
Well, the multitude of scandals that we've talked about and the absurdity of them drove headlines and I think created this mounting pressure that eventually was too much for Scott Pruitt to bear. But what Kristen Mink actually alluded to in her challenging of Mr. Pruitt in that moment was not about the scandals on the money and the absurdity of lotions, but it was about the fundamental need to protect human health and the environment. And let's go back to the original scandal for Scott Pruitt. It wasn't about the absurd stuff. It was about the fact that as an Oklahoma Attorney General, he was penning legislation and letters to the federal government written by the coal lobby and the oil lobby. And now we have an energy lobbyist running the agency for at least the next 210 days, which you can do under the Federal Vacancies Act without a confirmation. So in many ways, the original scandal that should have been enough in any other normal climate to tank Scott Pruitt is now front and center, even more so with Andy Wheeler.
Kristen, you strike me as someone who's a pretty avid news consumer, at least based on the litany you were able to recite to Scott Pruitt. I'm just curious what you think. I mean, how front of mind is something like the EPA to you?
Oh, this is fundamental. I mean, there's a lot of issues that are really hugely important right now. There are parents being separated from their children, and as a mother, it's hard to think, nothing is more urgent than that. At the same time, the environment is a nonpartisan issue. This literally has to do with the future of, humanity and the future of the Earth, and having a safe place for our kids to grow up and for them to have families and so on. So this is a huge issue for me.
Yeah, Dan, that strikes me as it'll be interesting to see the degree to which the Pruitt, the lotion and the insanity of this guy, who, by the way, was really serially abusing the public trust in a way I think that required his removal. So I want to be very clear about that. The agenda that he has been pursuing, that Miller presumably will pursue, doesn't strike me as a particularly popular agenda if sort of given the publicity it deserves.
I think that's right. And I think that there's two things that are important here politically. One is that it shows the activism of the progressive part of our country, even without having Democrats controlling any of the branches of government, can still be effective in taking out a truly morally bankrupt individual, even in this moment. And that's mobilizing and enabling, and that's an important thing for us. And then I think you're right. I think now the question is about core values: clean air, clean water. In every poll we tested when I worked in the Obama campaign, polling I saw at EPA, it's always one of the highest polling laws in the country, both the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. People understand the basic need for that. And Andy Wheeler is now going to represent policies that fundamentally run counter to what the American people want.
Well, let me follow up on that. Just as a kind of sort of end to all this, if you were to sort of write the epitaph for the Pruitt era, when you saw these stories, as someone who used to be liaison with the EPA, I mean, were you just as astounded as the rest of us were watching this from the outside?
Yeah, I really was. I mean, I think there's this great line from Shawshank Redemption that geology is a study of pressure and time. And if Scott Pruitt ever consulted a scientist, he would have known he was in big trouble with all the pressure over this amount of time that he was dealing with, but we know he didn't. But to your point, Chris, I was completely astounded. I was one who thought Scott Pruitt would be, from our perspective at least as an environmentalist, a competent villain in destroying the EPA, and that was really worrisome. It was buffoonery that I really did not expect from that guy, someone who had been a fairly significant political player player in Oklahoma. Andy Wheeler strikes me as more dangerous because he has kept a low profile. He's a Washington insider. He knows how to play this game, and he probably has been behind as much of the work at EPA, even in an acting capacity, as Scott Pruitt was. So in many ways, it's a victory for folks to get Scott Pruitt, who really is morally reprehensible, out of the government, but don't rest our laurels here. We need to go after Andy Wheeler just as hard and the rest of the administration's policies.
Kristen, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we got this guy out, and he's being replaced by somebody who's possibly worse. So, on the one hand, I think a big takeaway is that our voices matter, that everybody can be part of the critical mass, everybody can be part of making change, even when we don't have as much representation or hardly any representation in government that's effective right now. At the same time, when we look at who Scott Pruitt's being replaced with, it's somebody who has the exact same goals and is potentially going to be better at accomplishing them, and we're potentially not going to be able to get him out on corruption charges. He might not make that as easy for us as Scott Pruitt did. So I think what it all comes down to is that the midterms are really going to matter. Everybody needs to get to the polls this November, because we're not going to get somebody who's going to protect our air, protect our water, make the environment safe for our kids if we don't have a flipped Congress. We need to go Democrat in Congress this November 2018.
Well, what I will say here, Kristen, is that unlike almost every other scandal that's happened in this administration, this was the rare one where congressional Republicans did exert some oversight. There was a little bit. He ran afoul of them, and we saw how that played out. I mean, a big part of the sort of pulling the threads was the fact that there was some little bit, a smattering of congressional oversight, Dan, that happened here.
We can't give them credit for that. They put him in office. You know, they put him, somebody who had sued the EPA for their efforts to regulate the environment. You know, this Congress approved putting him in charge of the EPA. You have to know that he's going to be dismantling it from the inside. You have to know that this man, whose title literally has environmental protection in it, is not going to be doing the job. They put somebody in the position who they knew was not going to do the job.
Chris, I agree with Kristen. You can't give them credit, but last time we talked about this very issue a few weeks back, you know, we had talked about the OIG, the Investigator General in the agency. That report is coming out. I suspect that had something to do with the timing of all this. There's probably more that we don't know yet at this point. So there is some hope that the federal oversight checks can work as long as there's significant public pressure on people like Kristen who bring that to bear every single day.
Yeah, we should say OIG announced today they will continue with those investigations. Dan Cannon and Kristen Mink, who I don't know who represents you in Congress or your state house, but if you ever run against them, they should be worried. Thank you both.
That's very kind of you.
Thanks, Chris.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.